Hi everyone, welcome to the University of Nottingham Summer School 2020 talk by the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. This talk is about Jesus and women, and I'm Sara Parks, Assistant Professor in New Testament Studies at the University of Nottingham. In addition to being Assistant Professor in New Testament Studies, I'm now also transitioning into a research role as a Leverhulme early career researcher, where I'll be working on a project about the intersection of misogyny and anti-Judaism at the time when Judaism and Christianity were splitting apart into two different religions in antiquity. Some of the modules I've taught are the first year Introduction to New Testament, Intro to Biblical Greek, and second and third year modules such as Women and Gender in the New Testament and Life and Teaching of Jesus. What are the aims and objectives of this talk? I've broken it into sort of three movements. First, we're going to talk in general about what theology and religious studies are like at uni, as opposed to, say, a religion A-level or a philosophy A-level. Secondly, I'd like to talk about my own research on Jesus and gender. And then finally, I'd like to talk about what theology and religious studies is like here at the University of Nottingham, in case you're interested. First of all, theology and religious studies at university. What's that like, and how is that different from something like A-levels? Well, for one thing, theology and religious studies departments are usually the most or among the most interdisciplinary degrees you'll find at university. So what does that mean? It means that theology is not just one discipline. It's a cluster of different approaches all working together. We have on our team historians, we have philosophers, we have ethicists, we have experts in religion and digital media. We have experts in things like Gothic literature, modern British religion, medieval Islam. So all kinds of different approaches. So a sociological approach, a historical approach, literary approach. We have all of that. In this picture, you can see that we also take university, as opposed to A-levels, can really take a variety of learning forms. You'll see in this picture my Greek class is actually playing a game. Some of the pictures are from a game of like vocabulary charades or Pictionary. They're like drawing pictures for others to guess the vocab. And some of the pictures are from peer teaching. So they have each taken a topic and they are going to teach their peers about the topic. So it's very hands-on. We have seminars, we have lectures, we have discussions, we have presentations, we have students making blogs, students making video projects. We even sometimes have students doing theological art projects. It's really not just memorizing a bunch of information. University is more where you become a scholar at university and you practice. You get all the tools you need to practice really becoming a critical thinker, able to navigate the world. I've got 3 bullet points on this slide. Learning how to read, learning multiple angles, and learning about yourself. Those 3 things are at the heart of any humanities degree at university. So theology is no exception. What on earth do I mean by learning how to read? Obviously, you already know how to read or you wouldn't be coming to this summer school. But what I mean by learning how to read is learning how to read closely, carefully, between the lines. How to read an author's biases behind what the author is saying. How to read a text's time period based on clues from within it. How to read a Facebook status or a politician's speech based on what you know about persuasive rhetoric. All those kinds of things are things you learn at uni. And once you've practiced learning how to read, you practice learning how to read looking through different lenses. So the second bullet point is learning multiple angles. In my modules, let's take, for example, the module on Jesus, life and teachings of Jesus. At the beginning of the module, I teach everyone different approaches that you can take to interpreting texts. For example, a feminist approach, a Marxist approach or class-aware approach, a womanist approach, a literary approach, a text-critical approach, a historical approach. There are all kinds of different approaches that help pull out different information from the text. And it's not that all of the different approaches disagree with each other, it's that they highlight and spotlight different things that are kind of hidden there within the text that you only notice when you bring certain things into focus. And then finally, learning about yourself. When you're learning how to read texts, images, artifacts, coins, rhetoric, and then learning how to do that from multiple angles, what you end up doing is noticing your own suppositions, your own biases, your own predilections, and you come out of university with a greater understanding of the world, but also a greater understanding of what makes you tick. So narrowing into my research, I mentioned that I'm a historical Jesus researcher, and I'm a historian of sort of the Second Temple period of Judaism moving into early Christianity. So that's like the Hellenistic and early Roman periods. My latest book project has been focusing in on one aspect of the historical Jesus, and that is, what was his view on women? What was his relationship to women? And what can we learn about views of gender if we just look at one aspect of what we know about Jesus? And the aspect I chose to focus on was his sayings material. In other words, I analyzed just Jesus quotes that can be found in the New Testament to see if there were any hints in there about his attitude toward women and women and men as equals. And so that is called doing historical Jesus research, which means trying to put on the hat of a historian and finding out what really happened, quote unquote, in antiquity. So for Jesus, the New Testament texts were written at all different times over the next kind of 100, 150 years after his death. And they were written by different authors who had quite different views on things. And so if you're a historian and you're trying to piece together all these different texts and find out what is most likely to be the way this happened, if something's recorded 4 different ways and they don't match up, how is a historian supposed to guess which one is most likely? That's the field of historical Jesus research. So historical Jesus researchers have created a list of the sayings of Jesus that are most likely that he actually said. So I limited my study to only those sayings. And among them, I found something very interesting. I found that Jesus had a special way of speaking or teaching in pairs, male-female pairs. So that's how gender studies came into my study. So, gender studies is the lens you wear when you look at an ancient text or a modern text to find out what it is saying about gender or what it's saying about the relationship, the role of women. And so I found that Jesus had a special way of teaching that would be like one lesson was about a man, the next lesson was about a woman, but the lessons were identical. And he did this quite a lot. So I came to a few conclusions. Here are all of the pairs that I found. If you happen to have read the New Testament in the past or go to church, you may recognize a lot of these. They're little parables or sort of like teaching stories, and they come in pairs: the mustard seed and the yeast, the sheep and the coin, the field and the mill, the widows and the lepers, the neighbor and the widow, the queen of the south and the Ninevite men, the bread and the fish, the ravens and the lilies. Every single one of these pairs of parables has a male version and a female version. So Jesus was working with the idea of binary gender, and what I concluded was tailoring his teaching to match who was in his audience, which means both men and women were in his audience, and was delivering 2 examples of every message he gave, making sure that one example helped the women identify it and the second example helped the men identify with it. But it was the same lesson in both. So in a way, he was really making sure very deliberately to A, include women, and B, give the same message to women and men. So let's look at some examples of these more closely. Here's one of these parable pairs: the mustard seed and the yeast. And these translations are mostly mine because I worked from the Greek to look more closely, which is something you can do in a theology department. You can learn ancient Hebrew, ancient Greek, ancient Latin, and things like that, so that you can examine text for yourself, not in translation. So it says, "What is the rule of God like? And with what am I to compare it?" So this is Jesus talking. And he says, "It's like a seed of mustard, which a man took and threw into his garden. And it grew and developed into a tree, and the birds of the sky nested in its branches." The second one goes, "And again, with what am I to compare the rule of God? It is like yeast, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour until it was fully leavened." So it's a little lesson, a little teaching story, repeated twice, or it's one story, one lesson, but with 2 examples given. And the first example is masculine and the second example is feminine. It's not just masculine and feminine in that one is a man and one is a woman. It's also masculine and feminine in that one of the tasks is something that the men of the day did, which was gardening, reaping crops, farming. And the second one is a task that mostly was done by the women at the time, which is baking bread. Here's another one. The stories of the lost sheep and the lost coin. They go like this: "Which man of you, having 100 sheep," so we're talking about a shepherd here, which is a task normally done by men at the time, "which man of you having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, will not leave the 99 and go after the one which was lost until he finds it? Just so, I tell you, in heaven he rejoices over it more than over the 99. Or, what woman who has 10 coins, if she were to lose 1 coin, would not light a lamp and sweep the house and hunt until she finds? And on finding, she calls the friends and neighbors, saying, 'Rejoice with me, for I found the coin which I had lost.' Just so, I tell you, there's joy before the angels over one repenting sinner." So here's another kind of parallel pair. One of them has a man losing 1 sheep out of 100, and one of them has a woman losing 1 coin out of 10. And it's the same lesson in both, that one that's lost is almost more precious than the whole bunch of the ones that you still have. You put more energy into the lost one, and then there's rejoicing when it's found. So here again, we have a male example and a female example. One is a man, one is a woman, but we also see it reinforced by having shepherding being a typically masculine task at the time, and coins, taking care of the household monies, were typically a female task at the time, because a lot of the ancient world was divided into the spheres of public and private, and men were considered appropriate in the public sphere, whereas the private sphere was supposed to be dominated by women. So money is part of the household, so that's part of a woman's job in antiquity. Here's just one more example, so you get the idea of these. Now this one is a special kind. There are no men and women mentioned. So how is this a gender pair? I'll let you think about it and try to guess while I'm reading them. The ravens and the lilies. Consider the ravens. They neither sow, nor reap, nor store in barns, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? Consider the lilies. They neither card, nor toil, nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you? So here you have sort of the same story told twice. The message is, don't worry. Ravens don't worry, lilies don't worry, and yet they have all the food they need and they look beautiful. So how is this gendered? Well, look at the red part of the text. The first parable has tasks normally done by men of the day. Planting seeds, harvesting, putting them into barns, basically farming. Typically a male task in the first century. And then look at the red text in the second parable. Carding and spinning. These are words that are associated with wool, making clothing out of wool, which is very strongly associated with women in the early Roman Empire. So what does this all mean? Well, in a nutshell, here's a mosaic of a first century woman that I took this photo in Pompeii, which is an amazing place because a volcano erupted and kind of encapsulated this first century city of Pompeii, and it's been excavated almost exactly as it was in the first century. So there are many beautiful things there that really, if you're interested in New Testament times or early Roman Empire, you can go there and really get a taste of what life was like in a first century city. So here's this woman from a mosaic in Pompeii, and I'll just leave her up there while I kind of conclude what was my book about. So in a nutshell, my book A discovered that Jesus had a special rhetoric, a special way of speaking that he seems to have invented, which was deliberately a way of including women, giving the same message to both women and men, and making sure that everyone in his audience had something that could relate to them. So in a way, Jesus invented a new way of treating men and women equally in the ancient world. But at the same time, we can't jump to 21st century words like feminism and say like, oh, Jesus was a feminist, because feminism is a modern development. So some people like to jump on things like this about Jesus and then say, aha, Jesus was a feminist. Well, that's kind of rosy thinking. It's a lot more complicated than that, because in my research, I also looked at other Jews like Jesus at the time and before, and many different kinds of Jewish communities in the Hellenistic period were already including women in various ways. And so Jesus was a part of what Judaism was doing at the time in many ways. So that was an important thing that I had to add to my book, say that Jesus was an inventive guy who did include women in all kinds of he was very inclusive in all kinds of ways, but he wasn't the very first Jew to ever behave that way. So we can't go overboard. So in conclusion, what if you want to come study theology and religious studies with us at the University of Nottingham? What kind of options do you have? Well, it's very, very diverse. You can approach it from a lot of different angles: ecology, Hebrew, theology, literature, sociology of religion, media, Islamic studies, Judaism, atheism, all kinds of things. There are 4 pathways in to study with us, and they're all very, very mix and match. And the fifth one, it's in the philosophy department, but it's joint honors with us. So have a look at our prospectus, which is online in the pink part there. So in conclusion, research into Jesus is really complicated and you can approach it from a wide range of angles, and gender is one of those angles that can really illuminate new things, not just on historical Jesus research, but on any subject. And at university, theology and religious studies is really a whole new universe compared to religion at A levels. To find out more, check out these links that are in this slide. Especially check out my video on YouTube with my cat Sweet Pea. And thanks very much for giving me this opportunity to talk a bit about my research on Jesus and women.